Chapter 7. The Enlightenment. Beginning around the turn of the 17th century, there arose a new way of thinking about nature, as a malleable object to be conformed to man's needs and desires, as opposed to a foundational reality to which man must conform himself. The pioneers of the mechanical philosophy, as the forerunner of modern science was called, disregarded classical explanations of nature in terms of Aristotle's four causes, because they desired a different kind of knowledge which would give them technological control over nature. For the purposes of the new science, all that really mattered was what could be measured and mathematically modeled. It was not long before this shift of priority morphed into skepticism of the ontological reality of Aristotle's categories of formal and final causality. Aristotle's metaphysics became like the prating wisdom of William Shakespeare's Polonius to the modern scientific mind. The consequences of this change of perspective for fine art were not immediately apparent. Even though painters followed a theory of art defined by Platonic and Aristotelian notions of form, the painter's meticulous study of nature suited the ethos of the Enlightenment perfectly. What does an academic painter do but subject nature to measurement like a scientist? Indeed, it is not at all surprising that a painter such as Leonardo da Vinci was a pioneer in the scientific enterprise, or that Galileo Galilei studied drawing and taught classes in perspective and chiaroscuro at the Accademia in Florence. The art and science of painting was not only thoroughly medieval, but also thoroughly modern, which allowed it to advance in technical virtuosity and prestige through the end of the 19th century. The definitive break with Aristotelianism was René Descartes' turn to the subject, an epistemological turn based on skepticism of the senses as a basis of knowledge. This skepticism took two forms. It was in the first instance a method of arriving at certainty. Recognizing the utility of reinventing metaphysics on terms more conducive to the mechanical philosophy, René Descartes called everything into question for the sake of argument in the Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641. De omnibus dubitandum est, he wrote, all things must be doubted, not to become mired in skepticism, but to search for a foundation of sure and certain knowledge upon which to rebuild philosophy. The one fact on which he could cast no doubt was of his own subjectivity, it being logically incoherent to deny something so clearly and distinctly perceived. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes' next step was to make an ontological argument for the existence of God, who being all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, ensures that one's senses and intellect are in fact trustworthy. Descartes' skepticism was not purely methodological, however, as he also doubted the sufficiency of the senses in Aristotle's account of epistemology. According to Aristotle, all knowledge begins in the senses, the mind being like a blank tablet prior to sensory experience. The agent intellect arrives at the truth of things by abstracting out universals from particulars. Aristotle understood this process as a matter of simple numerical induction from phantasms produced by the imagination. Descartes found this account highly problematic. In the Principia Philosophiae, published in 1644, Descartes argues that one's field of vision does not resolve of itself into objects with a discernible nature, a point which he makes in reference to a ball of wax. Something that I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment which is in my mind. The only way the mind apprehends anything as an object of cognition, he claims, is by making a judgment on the basis of an innate mental representation of the world. He hypothesizes that God makes the incompleteness and imperfection of nature intelligible to us by infusing in the human mind ideas about the nature of things with which to make sense of things. A Cartesian subject does not, strictly speaking, perceive things directly with his senses, but instead constructs them out of sensory data from his interior model, just like a Platonic demiurge who constructs the material world from the ideal forms. The latter skepticism of the sufficiency of the senses was shared to a degree by the scholastics. St. Bonaventure, for one, believed that there is an incommensurability between the ordinary objects of sense, being created and mutable, and the immutable truths we come to know. He accounted for this incommensurability by combining Aristotle's theory of abstraction from particulars with a Neoplatonic theory of divine illumination. Aquinas did the same, saying, "By the seal of the divine light in us, all things are made known to us." There is something genuinely mysterious about the logical inference that is made by the rational intellect in the leap from sensory experience to immaterial essences. Man straddles the divide between animals and the angels as a body with sensory cognition and a spirit with a rational intellect. And as such, the human intellect sees not only by the light that strikes one's eyeballs, but also by the illumination of the eternal forms. The insightfulness which the scholastics attributed to the human intellect as a likeness of the uncreated light which is in God is similar to possessing infused knowledge as hypothesized by Descartes, although the scholastics would still have had their objections to Descartes. To reason at all, something must always be assumed, as Bertrand Russell lamented about mathematics, since the axioms do have to be assumed and cannot be proven. Descartes' cogito is not what he purported it to be, but makes tacit assumptions about logic and ontology, since it is not possible to doubt everything. To quote Peter Kraft, Aquinas would probably say in response to Descartes that you can't do epistemology without doing metaphysics, because what knowledge is depends on what is. Indeed, Descartes' skeptical method is simply an unconvincing justification for his new metaphysics, as the cogito presupposes what he was attempting to prove about ontology. The premise of the mechanical philosophy was that the book of nature is perfectly intelligible to the human mind and written in the language of mathematics. Cartesian rationalism conveniently laid the natural world out flat on a Cartesian plane, which was Descartes' great contribution to mathematics, to prove that area can be mapped onto a number line, which laid the foundation for Newton's fundamental theorem of calculus. From the cogito, Descartes deduced that there are precisely two types of substances, that which thinks and that which is thought. There is mind, res cogitans, and there is the spatial temporal world actualized by the act of thought, res extensa. The implication of this dualistic ontology was to turn nature into the sort of thing that can be mapped out by a scientist by defining nature in its essence as extension in space and time. Descartes' ontology also transformed the soul from the form of the body into a disembodied mind and left no room at all for explanations of nature in terms of souls and purposes, whereas an Aristotelian would account for gravity teleologically, as an example of the movement of all things toward their proper end like an arrow in flight toward its target. Descartes' novel ontology demanded mechanical laws of the sort posited by Galileo to account for motion. Plato had construed God as a divine craftsman and nature as a work of art, but Descartes' ontology made God into a manufacturer who imposes extrinsic purposes on a mechanical world. Descartes had no use for the Socratic attitude of wonder at the mystery of being. For Descartes, natural philosophy like the newly discovered Americas was a field ripe for exploration and conquest, as nature's secrets presented a new world to be discovered and mapped. It is certainly ironic that Descartes' name happens to be the word for maps in French. The subject of cartography will remind the art lover of Johannes Vermeer, whose paintings are often populated by them. To explain the effect of Cartesianism on art, we might begin by taking a brief excursion to Vienna to reflect on one of Vermeer's most celebrated masterpieces, The Art of Painting, painted between 1665 and 1668. I was fortunate to see this painting over Easter many years ago while I was a student studying in Florence. My funds were predictably limited as I was paying my tuition with a pair of portrait commissions which I had completed over the summer, a windfall which I probably did not deserve given the state of my skills. I had to make do with a budget of a few €100 for the week, which was a stimulating challenge. I scrounged up student tickets to the Volksoper and to the Musikverein, to hear the Vienna Philharmonic and to see Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, found an inn to my astonishment for €30 a night on the outskirts of the city, and purchased a pass at a modest price that promised to get me into all of Vienna's many art collections. When I arrived in Vienna, I discovered why I had money to spare. Speaking of maps, I would have done well to study one, since the hotel that I had booked was located an hour and a half by public transit outside the city and a good 5 miles from the last bus stop. As if that weren't enough, it was up a hill, a very long, steep hill that I charged up with my rucksack at 10 o'clock at night. It was an inauspicious beginning. By the time I arrived at my destination, nearly 2 hours later, I could barely get out the words that I needed in German to communicate with the person behind the desk, but she eventually figured out who I was and what to do with me. When I awoke the next morning, having recovered from my ordeal, I quickly reconciled with the Arcadian surround in which I unexpectedly found myself. The view was nothing to sneer at, and the meager continental breakfast I had anticipated turned out to be a feast of fine breads and pastries, cheese, fruit, and muesli with fresh squeezed orange juice, out of all proportion to the price. What is more, I soon learned after a slightly challenging conversation with the owner, who was not accustomed to English-speaking visitors, much less my broken German, that the lodge ran shuttles up and down the mountain so that I would not have to repeat the journey on foot unless I chose to, as I did several times. My fortunes had taken a turn for the better. The art collections in Vienna are exceptional, and I was eager to see them for the first time. The highlight of the trip was, of course, the Kunsthistorisches Museum, where I spent the first and last days of my visit. Vermeer's The Art of Painting is one of the gems of the KHM's collection. Standing before it, I was entirely taken aback to discover the painting's scale. It is needless to say that Vermeer typically painted in miniature on panels rarely bigger than a sheet of paper, relative to which The Art of Painting seemed larger than life, as if he had painted a doorway rather than a window. The effect is all the more surprising because it is painted exactly as Vermeer would have painted it in miniature, but blown up, as if seen under a magnifying glass, at some significant cost to the illusion. I quickly got the impression that Vermeer was using this showpiece, which never left his studio so long as he lived, to show off the machinery of his deceptively realistic style and give his viewer a close-up of things that are more difficult to see on a tiny panel. Impressive as this painting was, its perceptual incoherence did puzzle me. What I saw on close inspection was not what I expected to see. In Dutch genre painting, there is usually a clear focus on a single plane of vision, as in the works of Gabriel Metsu or Gerard Terborch. The foreground is typically rendered with a degree of clarity, and as the space recedes, the image moves out of focus, as if captured with a telephoto lens, locating the image both spatially and temporally in relation to the viewer. Since the eye can focus on objects near or far but not both at the same time, narrowing the field of vision captures the temporality of depth perception. Some such play of sharpness and softness is almost always present in the most illusionistic and naturalistic styles of painting, from the minutely detailed illusionism of Balthasar Denner to the painterly naturalism of Rembrandt van Rijn. As an art student at the time, I was being beaten over the head daily with this ruler, and so it was conspicuous to me that Vermeer had done something rather different in the art of painting. The foreground of the painting is strikingly sharp, and yet paradoxically out of focus in terms of its rendering. The brushstrokes in the drape that crops the image on the left are crisp and flat. They catch the eye and immediately disappoint it by upsetting the illusion, forcing the eye deeper into the picture in search of resolution. Each successive plane resists that resolution, either for want of detail or for lack of modeling. The eye finds rest neither in the figure of the artist at his easel, who disintegrates into discrete flat shapes, nor in the chandelier over his head as so many flat daubs. Only in the artist's model and in the map that hangs across the wall, painted with soft, nuanced precision in raking light, does the eye find relief. Indeed, the map is the only form in this painting that is rendered to the full extent of Vermeer's powers of observation. It is the only form painted in trompe-l'œil, though even it cannot be seen altogether clearly, if only because it is too far away to make out. The art historian Norman Bryson has made a similar observation about the painting's surprising formal qualities, as I later discovered. Quote, "At no single distance from the painting will the spectator discover its global intelligibility, for the painting is not conceived in the model of a physical transaction, but as a plurality of local transcriptions which nowhere melt in the fusion of simultaneous disclosure. The viewing subject assumed by the image has no existence in tangible space, just as the painting has been painted by no one, which artist in which studio has created what is seen, and lacks an empirical origin, what is the real time of the image, so it is to be received as notional, notational, as a mathematical fiction. The viewer can try any number of points and distances away from the canvas, but the image will never cohere, singly or serially, around them. Unquote. Whatever Vermeer's intention, I detected in the map a possible allusion to René Descartes, who had died only 15 years before the image was painted. As the leading representative of Galileo's mechanical philosophy and longtime resident of the Dutch Republic, Descartes would have been a natural source of inspiration. There is no mistaking Vermeer's sympathy for the clockwork universe, which is on display in every painting he made, as an image of systematic regularity in which the pieces fit together like the gears of a Swiss pocket watch. There is a perfection in the placement of Vermeer's form, which always falls into synchrony with an unmistakably Euclidean order. His intention everywhere implied, every accident and asymmetry betrays the most painstaking deliberation. There is even the purported trace of a mechanical aid, be it mirrors or a camera obscura, which is supposed to have inspired the more unusual optical qualities of his paintings. I found further support for an allusion to Cartesianism in Vermeer's treatment of the subject matter. The art of painting is an allegory of creation. Peering over the artist's shoulder, we see the flat imprimatura of the canvas, the sublime nothingness from which a painting is beginning to take shape, as in Creatio ex nihilo. Like a Platonic demiurge, the painter works from a prototype, for we see the artist's model, whom Vermeer has preveniently idealized apropos of Plato's ideal forms. Dressed as the muse of history, she holds a copy of Thucydides or Herodotus, and a trumpet as suggested by Cesare Ripa in the Iconologia, though she does not look away, as Ripa stipulates, but glances coyly with downcast eyes toward the foreground. Vermeer shows us her face as if to suggest that nature's mathematical model is discoverable. The artist knows the plans he has made, and if one only bothers to look at his model, so do we. The curtain which hangs across the foreground is drawn back so that we can peer behind it and discover the secrets of a painting's creation, just as the mechanical philosopher discovers nature's secrets. Vermeer conceals the face of the artist and most of his canvas from view, because the face of God is hidden, and so is the thing in itself. The Cartesian subject sees only an ideal truth represented by the artist's model, of which the artist's painting is but a dim and feeble copy. The temporal incoherency of the art of painting noted by Norman Bryson follows logically from the disembodiment of the Cartesian subject. As Ludwig Wittgenstein notes in the Tractatus, the Cartesian subject is not in the world. As a disembodied thinking substance, the res cogitans does not have extension in time and space, and so does not look from a locatable vantage point. The mind stands outside the polis and looks down from a transcendental olive grove like a proper philosopher. The mind of the Cartesian subject is a private inner world cut off from the outside world, as the eye on Descartes' understanding is not a window through which the external world acts on the soul. Rather, the mind is what acts on the world by projecting its ideas onto a flattened field of vision, which as a mere potency actualized by the thinking subject is not intelligible in itself, but derives its intelligibility from the measure of the mind. What Immanuel Kant later claimed as his Copernican revolution in philosophy had in fact already been accomplished by Descartes, as there is a perfect inversion of subject and object in Cartesianism. To an Aristotelian, the mind is like a wax tablet on which reality imprints itself through the senses, and truth is the conformity of the mind to the object. To a Cartesian, objective reality is the blank slate, and truth is the conformity of the object to the mind. By painting a scene which is not entirely intelligible in itself, Vermeer leaves it to the viewer as a Cartesian subject to complete the image by constructing it from one's own interior model. Indeed, it is conspicuous that there is no delineation in the art of painting. There are edges, to be sure, but not a single line. The most naturalistic painters avoid linearity because lines don't exist in nature, but idealizing painters draw them anyway to capture the essence of things. Implicit in the contour of the body is the soul that gives form to the body, making line the most intuitive weapon against the soullessness of mimesis as the most direct representation of the formal cause of the body. The art of painting is not so much a representation of form as a transcription of sense data. Vermeer obviously intended to paint no more than is immediately present to the senses. He painstakingly effaced every trace of drawing in a disinterested transcription of retinal impressions and overlapping shapes. On close inspection, everything begins to come apart into an array of isolated transcriptions. The only things which are quite whole, the only self-reflexive totalities which have a convincing form, are the model and the map, and even the map is little more than a minute transcription of sense perceptions. For want of any integrating principle, the art of painting obliges the viewer to supply one. The viewer is meant to become the artist by inferring all that Vermeer has neglected to paint. It is left to one's own eye to complete the chandelier, for example, because what Vermeer has actually painted is a few disconnected daubs. It is left to the viewer's faculty of judgment to complete the idea of form, which is not fully determined by the painting. Vermeer's The Art of Painting shows what the world looks like under the magnifying glass of Cartesian rationalism, and it also anticipates the decay of Descartes' certainties into the skepticism and agnosticism of the empiricist. Vermeer was rediscovered in the 19th century after having fallen into obscurity because he represented a view of reality which was only taken for granted in the 19th century, when the philosophy of the Enlightenment became the wisdom of the common man and artists adopted increasingly photographic styles of naturalism. The more a scientific predilection predominated over the poetic and metaphysical, the more fine art became a soulless imitation of appearances, since modern science has no grasp of immaterial realities. Although Descartes intended the metaphysical subject to be a sure foundation of knowledge, the turn to the subject soon ended in skepticism and agnosticism about everything that truly matters. Once the mechanical philosophy was carried to completion by Sir Isaac Newton's laws of motion, the world appeared to be governed from the bottom up by mechanical laws which impose a rigid determinism on motion to the exclusion of free will, the soul, and all occult causes, with the exception of gravity. As action across space without a mechanism, gravity is a force which defies all mechanical intuitions. Newton firmly believed that gravity's hidden mechanism would one day be discovered, but by David Hume's time it was accepted that nature is less intelligible than the mechanical philosophy had once presupposed. Newtonian physics proved that nature does not conform to one's innate idea of mechanical causality. Furthermore, Descartes' ontological proof of God's existence, which was supposed to ensure the trustworthiness of the mind's innate model of the world, was also cast in doubt by David Hume, who reasoned that nothing can be known with certainty beyond the immediate, brute facts of sensory data. All that can really be known are the phenomena of sense experience, a soulless catalog of parts and effects whose true causal relations are empirically impenetrable. While scientists can model observable phenomena, which has technological utility, they cannot arrive at genuine knowledge of the metaphysical causes of anything, be they formal, material, or otherwise. Since Hume regarded formal and final causes by which value judgments are made as an unstable, subjective inference, he drew a sharp distinction between facts and values. As he writes in a treatise of human nature, published in 1739, there is no ought from is. When no one can say what the nature of anything is or what anything is for, judgments about the difference between good and evil lose their objective basis in nature, and so value judgment became a matter of sentiment for philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. This was a highly convenient implication for the purposes of the Enlightenment, whose founding objective was to mold nature according to man's needs and desires. If the nature of things is unknowable, then the human will is free to make of nature what one will. The objections raised by empiricists to Cartesian rationalism did not endanger the Enlightenment, though Immanuel Kant certainly had his apprehensions. As the first great German idealist, Kant set out with the noble intention of rescuing free will and the soul from Newtonian determinism, and at the same time rescuing epistemology from Hume's skepticism. To redeem the sciences from Hume's agnosticism about causality, to save ethics and aesthetics from Hume's subjectification of value judgment, and to shield religion from Hume's skepticism of the divinity was Kant's ambition, though not by refuting any of Hume's conclusions. Kant accepted that reality is unknowable and maintained that it doesn't matter. Kant's governing premise was that all human knowledge bears the distinct stamp of human cognition. In order for objects of experience to appear to us, the mind not only relies upon the senses, but also upon innate modes of processing sensory information, such as categories of space and time. The subject recognizes objects of experience not as they are in themselves, but as they appear under the subjective form of human sensibility, as having extension in space and time. This allowed Kant to conclude that scientific laws merely describe the world of appearances and not reality as it is in itself, making room for free will, God, and the soul among all that lies beyond the limits of reason. This convenient solution had the inconvenient effect of making metaphysical concepts unintelligible, mere words whose meaning is equivocal because it is not found in the world of experience. As Wittgenstein famously said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." Despite an intention to show how objectivity is possible in spite of the perspectival uniqueness of the subject, the effect of Kant's idealism was to reduce metaphysics to a branch of psychology. As an art student just beginning my studies in Florence, I considered myself something of a Kantian, having become acquainted with the critique of judgment at school just the year before. While finding my way around in the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance, I eagerly set about putting my faculty of judgment to the test in the corridors of the Bargello, the Palatine Gallery, and the Uffizi. The Uffizi is, of course, one of the great museums of the world, and an obvious location to search for an inspiring encounter with art, though what I was after eluded me at first, if only because my taste was unformed and the works which I was able to appreciate were so famous that I could not be confident that my judgment was unbiased by the estimation of art historians. From Titian's Venus of Urbino to Botticelli's Primavera, Michelangelo's Donitondo, Raphael's Madonna of the Goldfinch, and Leonardo's Adoration of the Magi, I had a star-studded cast of artworks to enjoy on my weekly walk-through of the museum, but I was determined to find something which I had not seen before in reproduction. I wanted the satisfaction of discovering a great work of art for myself, and I also wanted it to be a mature work from the High Renaissance, from the early Cinquecento, possessing none of the primitivisms of the previous century. As the months went by, I began to spend more of my time at the Palatine Gallery across the river, attracted by its larger collection of late Renaissance and Baroque paintings, almost all previously unknown to me, but in the spring I returned for one last visit to the Uffizi. It had been a good 4 months since I had visited the collection, and it was as if I were seeing it for the first time, an immensely satisfying experience. Just as I was preparing to leave after taking in a deftly painted portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger of Sir Richard Southwell, a privy councillor to Henry VIII, who was a witness at the trial of St. Thomas More and grandfather of the Catholic martyr Robert Southwell, I walked into the last room in the southeast corner of the upper gallery. From across the river, just above the Bobley Gardens, the evening sun was shining into the gallery, prompting me to cover my eyes as I entered. I turned, and as I did, I saw a painting that I had overlooked 24 times or more, lost in the shadows of a poorly lit room. It was a small canvas, less than 3 feet in height, yet it commanded my attention and quickly eclipsed everything I'd encountered that day. I saw the Blessed Virgin kneeling adoringly over the Christ child, surrounded by the accoutrements of a stable and set in a classical ruin. It vaguely reminded me of images by Leonardo and Raphael of the Virgin and Child, but in contrast to Leonardo's murky chiaroscuro and Raphael's crisp local colors with their ridged impastos of tempera, this was an image whose exquisite coloring sacrificed nothing to its equally exquisite draftsmanship. The lapis, vermilion, and green earth which clothed the Virgin sang pure, unalloyed notes yet melted seamlessly with breathtaking atmosphere into the softly illuminated ruddy shadows of the stable. The deepest darks in the crevasses of the Virgin's cloak completed the scale and accentuated the illumination. Aided by a loose cropping, the space was voluminous and utterly persuasive, adroitly combining both tonal and linear means to express the movement into the picture plane. Looking closely, the surface had only the faintest craquelure, so fine that one could still perceive the soft, feathery touch of the brushwork in the Virgin's graceful hands raised lovingly over the child. The drawing was expressive and credible, with nothing awkward or hackneyed in the posture and a face full of delicate pathos. The subtle symmetry was equally striking. The placement of the lines wove an adagio across the surface of the canvas, with a rhythmic regularity in its interplay of perpendicular, parallel, and symmetrical lines. In the background, I saw a classical column, which seemed out of place in the humble setting of Christ's birth until I recognized its iconographic logic to foreshadow the flagellation. I then noticed a palm tree in the background, anticipating the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and a saddle in the middle ground alluding to the flight into Egypt. Other details suggested the crowning with thorns. This consummate work of art was by Antonio Allegri, known by his place of birth as Correggio. Although Giorgio Vasari criticized Correggio for having never studied in Rome, he praised Correggio's color as second to none, and said that the man would have worked miracles had he seen the art of Michelangelo. I would avow that Correggio worked at least one miracle when he painted The Adoration of the Child in 1526. By the time I discovered this painting, I was becoming well informed about what a painting should look like, but I was surprised to find as I related this experience to my friends and acquaintances that no one shared my high estimation of this painting. Even though it had enjoyed pride of place alongside the collection's most celebrated works as depicted in Johann Zoffany's 18th century painting of the Tribuna, the qualities which distinguished this painting clearly were not obvious to an uninformed viewer, myself included, considering how many months had transpired before I noticed it. There was a faint irony in this at the time, because as an aspiring Kantian, I prided myself for disregarding expert authority on the premise that a painting is only as good as it looks, which any disinterested viewer ought to be able to see. The beautiful, according to Kant, is that which without any concept is cognized as the object of a necessary satisfaction. The judgment of beauty is disinterested in the sense that it cannot be based on an interest in the object for the ends it might achieve, as a judgment of the good might be, since this would require a concept of ends and means. The judgment of beauty also cannot be supported by argument or by authority, which would likewise entail a conceptual basis. Yet, my experience of Correggio's painting seemed to imply that my judgment was biased by a newfound technical awareness and based on a concept of craftsmanship. Not only art critics and historians, but painters too have a peculiar perspective on art, one which is both heightened and potentially distorted by their proximity to it. Corrupted by the habits of the studio, a painter tends to stick his nose into a painting and scrutinize its construction and traces of technique, which signify nothing in particular to a typical viewer. I wondered whether this might misguide a painter's judgment. Preoccupied by the mechanics of painting, a painter is prone to confuse his delight in fine craftsmanship with his delight in beauty, the judgment of which is quite independent of the concept of perfection, according to Kant. A work of fine art cannot be judged like mechanical art by its adherence to the rules of the craft. Every art presupposes rules, yet the concept of beautiful art does not permit the judgment of its beauty to be derived from any rule which has a concept as its determining ground. Fine art is only possible as a product of genius, which gives the rule to art. The work of genius follows a rule all its own, which resists explicit enumeration. Although this idea was thoroughly corrupted by the Romantics and used to justify all kinds of lawlessness in modern art, the premise that fine art cannot be judged by its adherence to rules is surely correct. A fine artist must rise above the level of aping imitation by mastering the rules of his art in such a way as to transform them into an implicit logic unique to himself. Genius properly understood is another name for mastery. In the same year that the Critique of Judgment was published in 1791, The French painter Anne-Louis Giraudet painted his first and perhaps his greatest masterpiece, The Sleep of Endymion, which he, being a pensioner at the French Academy in Rome, was obliged to submit to a committee of academicians back home in Paris to prove his mastery of the male nude. The committee found much to criticize, from the statuesque treatment of the anatomy to the stony coloring and the indistinctness of the lighting. They had, after all, expected an academic study, with a drapery thrown in and a classical title slapped on for good measure. What they received instead was a work of genius which broke all of their rules. After carefully stipulating every rule which Giraudet had broken, the committee commended him for creating a sublime work of art, exceeding every expectation. I was reluctant to conclude that Correggio's painting was any less deserving of my admiration for requiring some familiarity with the rules of the craft to see its exceptional quality, and so I rejected this explanation, only to face the more worrisome prospect of falling down a bottomless pit of subjectivism, in which there is no accounting for taste. De gustibus non est disputandum. I was acquainted with the idea that subjective taste might be a groundless preference for the familiar, limiting fine art's universality to the universe of a given art world. George Dickey's institutional definition was ringing like tinnitus in my ears. If good taste were nothing more than an institutionally conditioned prejudice, then it would make very little sense to debate the matter. There would be no point in trying to exercise good judgment if aesthetic judgment were intrinsically relativistic. Why not betray myself and give in to the voice of society if the voice within has no particular claim on the truth, particularly when there is money and status to gain by it, to say nothing of the derision already incurred for my recalcitrance toward modern art? Why be honest if honesty is a mental handicap and a form of immaturity which one should grow out of as soon as possible? To speak of taste as a matter of conscience sounds overblown, because one does not think of beauty as having to do with morality, but speaking truthfully is certainly a matter of conscience. Even the smallest white lie can spread like a cancer as one person after another is led to doubt himself and repeat the same idle chatter until reality disappears behind a vast consensual illusion. Not about to reject the evidence of my own eyes, I returned to the critique of judgment with confidence that Kant would show me the way out of my quandary. In the relevant passage, Kant posits a paradox, that judgments of beauty are both subjective and universal. They are subjective because judgments of beauty are based on pleasure, but they are apparently universal because people like myself expect others to share their judgments of beauty, as though beauty were a property of objects. If everyone ought to recognize beauty where others genuinely see it, Kant surmises, then judgments of beauty must follow a universal pattern similar to cognitive judgment. In cognitive judgment, vision becomes meaningful through mental representations, which Kant defines as images circumscribed by concepts. Images in the imagination simultaneously guide and are directed by the application of a concept, which represents what unites related perceptions. When you see a cat, for instance, you don't just see a retinal impression of certain masses of color migrating across your plane of vision. On the contrary, you reflexively make a cognitive judgment and interpret what you see in terms of the concept cat, prompted by an involuntary recognition of your internal image of a cat. In fact, the cat is more immediately present to the senses than the pattern of light, smell, or sound the cat makes. As every art student knows, it is actually quite difficult to separate the sensory manifold from the thing itself and see the retinal impression as an array of shapes which can be mapped onto a two-dimensional plane. The senses are instantaneously comprehended by imaginatively structuring, recollecting, and combining related sense perceptions and applying a concept to them. As Kant observes, this associative labor which lends objective cognitive judgments their universality is equally characteristic of judgments of beauty. To appreciate music, for example, one must be able to hear relations of tonality and meter, an achievement which is not only perceptual but requires some imaginative labor. While the tones themselves are immediately perceived, the relations between them can only be recognized through the ordering of perception, by noting changes in pitch, volume, and timbre from one moment to the next, recalling the notes that came before and anticipating the notes to follow. Thus, the imagination performs the very same synthesis of perceptions in the recognition of beauty as in an objective cognitive judgment, which is why they would both be universal. The only difference is that the judgment of beauty is free from the circumscription of a concept and results in pleasure rather than understanding. There is an obvious difference between knowing music theory and being able to hear the relations that music theory describes. A person does not have to have a concept of rhythm or harmony to enjoy music. Yet all the music theory in the world could not salvage the experience of listening to music for those unlucky few who are so tone-deaf they can't hear a tune. A highly experienced listener who is capable of applying concepts to what he hears will very likely be more perceptive than the average person. But any aesthetic pleasure he finds in it is still rooted in the imaginative ordering of perception, which may be in harmony with his understanding, but is still separate from it. While his attention may be attuned by concepts of music theory, his heightened pleasure in music is based on the superior reserves of his imagination, which through long experience has become a treasure trove of association with which to synthesize new listening experiences. The scholastics would call this the formation of the cogitative power. One must learn to love what is beautiful, since good taste is not innate but has to be cultivated, as Edmund Burke argues in his Inquiry on the Sublime and Beautiful, published in 1757. It took me time to see the beauty of Correggio's painting, because it takes time to learn how to see. My newfound delight was a result of my growing familiarity with Renaissance paintings, helped along by the concepts of the craft, but not based on them. The heightened aesthetic pleasure which I experienced was primed by months of immersion in such works of art, enabling a depth of visual association I had not known before. Cultivating a deep familiarity with great art is the most important and often the most neglected part of an artist's education. Like other students, I initially had a naive preference for the most illusionistic naturalism, and I was entirely unforgiving of anything that I perceived as a mannerism or a primitivism, but the critique of judgment posed a challenge to this prejudice of mine. Reiterating Plato's skepticism of the imitative arts, Kant observes that the mere imitation of beautiful objects is obviously soulless. According to Kant, a work of fine art must further inspire in the viewer a frame of mind which is at once harmonious and excited, whereby the viewer vicariously experiences what the artist presumably experiences in the throes of creation, moved not only by sensations, but by the pleasure of cognition. Kant declares that the soul of fine art is in the sensuous presentation of an idea which cannot be expressed conceptually, which he terms an aesthetic idea. This, by Kant's estimation, is the stuff of genius and what truly makes a work of art fine art. For all practical purposes, what Kant meant by an aesthetic idea I was at a loss to say. While I supposed that it must have something to do with what Giovanni Bellori meant by the idea of the painter, I did not see how Bellori's Platonic reasoning could be transposed onto Kant's philosophical system, and I did not necessarily agree with Bellori's judgment. I loved Caravaggioism, and I saw no great merit in the sort of deadening idealization that Bellori's argument seemed to favor. Surely, I thought, what Kant meant by an aesthetic idea cannot simply amount to idealization. Eventually, I returned to Kant's own words for clarity. He explains himself as follows. The imagination, as a productive faculty of cognition, is very powerful in creating another nature, as it were, out of the material that actual nature gives it. We entertain ourselves with it when experience proves too commonplace, and by it we remold experience, always indeed in accordance with analogical laws, but yet also in accordance with principles which occupy a higher place in reason, laws too which are just as natural to us as those by which understanding comprehends empirical nature. Thus we feel our freedom from the law of association, which attaches to the empirical employment of imagination, so that the material which we borrow from nature in accordance with this law can be worked up into something different which surpasses nature. Such representations of the imagination we may call ideas, partly because they at least strive after something which lies beyond the bounds of experience, and so seek to approximate to a presentation of concepts of reason, intellectual ideas, thus giving to the latter the appearance of objective reality, but especially because no concept can be fully adequate to them as internal intuitions. The poet ventures to realize to sense rational ideas of invisible beings, the kingdom of the blessed, hell, eternity, creation, etc., or even if he deals with things of which there are examples in experience, e.g. death, envy, and all vices, also love, fame, and the like, he tries, by means of imagination, which emulates the play of reason in its quest after a maximum, to go beyond the limits of experience and to present them to sense with a completeness of which there is no example in nature. It is, properly speaking, in the art of the poet that the faculty of aesthetical ideas can manifest itself in its full measure. But this faculty, considered in itself, is properly only a talent of the imagination." End quote. The Earl of Shaftesbury made a similar point when he described the artist as a just Prometheus under Jove, the fashioner of a fantastic symbolic world by which to experience all that lies beyond the bounds of ordinary experience. By means of the poetic imagination, an artist makes the invisible sensible and presents the transcendent in an embodied form. Like Bellori's idea of the painter, Kant's aesthetic idea is an idea of the nature of things, although it is not an idea which corresponds with reality, art not being an activity of the reason, but a type of play according to Kant. Bellori believed that an artist imaginatively exceeds the mere transcription of appearances by an interior light, which reveals an idea of beauty corresponding more faithfully to the true nature of reality. Kant characterizes the poetic imagination as a creative power which produces another nature, altogether free from any law of association with reality. In his estimation, the invisible world of heaven and hell, of God and the soul, i.e., of things in themselves, cannot be known, since it lies beyond the limits of reason. Therefore, what the poet produces by imagining it is not knowledge. Art is not a way of knowing, at least not according to Kant. It struck me for the first time that I was not in agreement with Kant. There is merit in his account of the poetic imagination, since artists do gesture imaginatively at the ineffable, but Kant's account also presents a problem. According to Kant, art bears no evident relation to truth. In gesturing at the ineffable, the work of art does not actually signify anything real. Kant described the judgment of fine art only in terms of perceptual psychology, because he mischaracterized the work of art merely as a perceptual object rather than a symbol or an allegory of anything beyond itself. In Kant's theory of art, the work of art feigns a greater significance, but it does not actually signify anything other than what the thing itself is. In the art object, existing for its own sake, purposeless yet possessing an air of purpose, the rational subject enjoys at most an illusory experience of intuitive, immediate, and inexplicable understanding of the ineffable. Fine art is not a matter of discovering or imparting eternal verities, but instead about the production of a certain kind of experience, of a conceptless harmony between the imagination and the understanding, according to Kant. Kantian aesthetics has its appeal, because modern people naturally approach works of art in a gallery or museum in ignorance of what the works might mean and desirous of aesthetic pleasure, an intuitive and immediate experience of the beautiful which demands no particular expertise. Thus, the influence of Kantian aesthetics was swift, far-reaching, and disastrous. It inspired every subsequent theory of modern art, and its effect was the aestheticization of art in the 19th century. As invented by Edmund Burke and coined by Alexander Baumgarten, the field of aesthetics was not originally intended to be a philosophy of beauty or fine art, but the science of sensuous pleasure. Before Kant, fine art was never believed to be exclusively aesthetic in nature, as fine art was supposed to please and instruct. Art was beautiful and true, its beauty the likeness of an uncreated beauty. Kant reduced fine art to a matter of disinterested pleasure, a debasement analogous to the disordering of marriage in the modern world, which has perversely placed the pleasure of the conjugal act ahead of its purpose. Art's liaison with the sensuous science commenced like every great romance, in swoons of ecstasy worthy of Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary. Like the serpent in paradise, what aesthetic philosophy promised to artists was godlike independence from any moral, political, or religious function, the freedom to sate the pure, simple desire for disinterested pleasure. Since fine art was already becoming a part of general commodity production, addressed not to God or a monarch or a patron, but to any anonymous customer with the money to buy it and the taste to appreciate it, Kant's emancipation of fine art gave artists a much-needed solution to the dysfunctionality of art in the emergent order of liberal society. Pried loose from every social obligation, artists announced that they would no longer be the lackeys of power. Victory was seized from the loss of art's purposes, and the artist styled himself a prophet with a unique capacity for spiritual transcendence and humane critique, since he now stood at a sufficient distance from society to critique society. So began art's tumultuous affair with the sensuous science, and it seemed promising enough, for what could be more spiritually transcendent than an illicit love affair? Yet there was a price to be paid for art's independence. By making art into a realm where the dilettante and the voyeur are most at home, aesthetics cheapened art. In the Renaissance, art was like Dante's Beatrice, Petrarch's Laura, and Botticelli's Simonetta Vespucci, a mirror of the eternal through whom beauty was venerated as a divine name. By relieving art of its truth-bearing function and making art merely a matter of taste, like a piece of meat to be judged by the appetitive pleasure it gives, aesthetics turned this goddess of beauty into a whore. The clock struck 10, to turn a line from Shakespeare's As You Like It, and the contemplation of beauty became the wisdom of a fool. The degeneration of beauty went hand in hand with Kant's elevation of the sublime. In Kantian theory, art is concerned only with the beautiful, while the sublime pertains to an experience of nature. If beauty is an experience of harmony between the imagination and the reason, the sublime is an experience of disharmony. Beauty reposes, while the sublime rends and upsets us. If beauty is a delight, the sublime is a turbulent emotional experience of reason's thwarted yet invigorating attempt to compass the formlessness and the boundlessness of nature. In a Kantian or a Cartesian worldview, nature does not present itself to the senses as something already ordered, but as a sublime chaos upon which the human mind imposes a rational order. The Cartesian subject is a demiurge, and so is the Kantian subject, though the difference is that the latter ultimately loses the battle with chaos, because the sublimity of nature exceeds man's power to impose order. As a rationalist, Descartes defined nature a priori as perfectly intelligible. Nothing is permitted in Descartes' ontology to exceed the measure of the human intellect. In Kantian metaphysics, everything exceeds the measure of the human intellect. What one would seem to grasp of the nature of things are only nominal essences, while the noumena, things in themselves as they exist objectively outside of thought, are unknowable. As such, not only do a starry night sky and the craggy Swiss Alps constitute an experience of the sublime, but even Wordsworth's quotidian field of daffodils could present a prospect onto nature's bottomless, unsearchable depths. Confronted with nature's sublimity, the imagination and the senses cannot properly take in what lies before them or satisfy reason's demand for a perfectly ordered picture. Yet in being thus denied, the reason enjoys a sense of its independence from the senses and of its dignity as a supersensible power able to stand astride the infinite and survey it. The sublime is an experience of tragic heroism. The sublime being a more exalted experience than the beautiful, artists set out in pursuit of the sublime with ever-increasing disregard for the beautiful. Mere sensory pleasure was deemed effeminate and assigned the lower rank relative to manly sublimity. What this meant in practice was that artists began to rid art of its rational order, the sublime being an experience of formlessness. Kantian aesthetics set fine art on a trajectory which ended in the infinitely sublime nothingness of a blank canvas. Such was the ironic effect of art's aestheticization, that by making the fine arts merely a matter of beauty, they soon ceased to be concerned with beauty at all. Despite Kant's robust defense of the universality of aesthetic judgment, to say nothing of Edmund Burke's before him, art descended into pure subjectivism. Modern and postmodern art is impervious to aesthetic judgment because it has nothing to do with the beautiful. To judge it by its failure to produce an experience of the beautiful is a category mistake. The merits of an ordinary art object susceptible of judgment might be measured in reference to the labor and the skill, or even the genius that went into it, but modern and postmodern art refuses to be so contained. Its potential value is as infinite as its formlessness. There is a famous dilemma debated in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. Is the good loved by the gods because it is good, or is it good because it is loved by the gods? As metaphysical subjects, we human beings have become the gods, for whom the good is what it is because it pleases us. By producing self-consciously worthless art and marketing it for millions of dollars, the art world poses a rhetorical question. Why does anything have value but because one values it? What nihilism means, according to Friedrich Nietzsche, is that the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. If values are a subjective projection, then value is not real but only an empty abstraction which comes from an evaluator. If the true, the good, and the beautiful are values, then this can only mean that they do not constitute anything in themselves. All that is solid has melted into air. Furthermore, the reality in itself, which a thing loses upon becoming value, passes to the evaluator. The metaphysical subject not only abstracts the thing from itself, but like a vampire sucks that abstracted lifeblood into himself. As the only and universal measure of all value, who alone has no price, the metaphysical subject takes on the role of reality in itself. He becomes the supreme being who defines what it means to be. As Nietzsche was only too eager to acknowledge, the modern and postmodern subject is an antichrist, the epitome of St. Paul's man of iniquity, the son of perdition, who opposeth and is lifted up above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself as if he were God.